So I continue with the socio-psychological processes of production of spoken language. What I'm presenting in this slide is Lavelle's model, which was presented in 1989. It's relatively old if you compare it with some recent models of speaking, but I think it's still something that people often cite. So as you see in this representation of the model, there are quite a few components and processes. The first component right at the bottom of this chart is the long-term memory component, which comprises knowledge about the topic, about the language, knowledge about the context of interaction, and context itself can be broken down into several other components, such as the immediate environment. For example, if you're talking about a restaurant, you know a lot of stuff about that restaurant, or you know a little bit about it, its location, or generally speaking what people do at a restaurant, and so on and so forth. Or about the interlocutor with whom you are speaking. That's your familiarity with the interlocutor and other aspects of the context of interaction. All of these are stored in your long-term memory. Then this knowledge, this, let's say, store of knowledge is used to retrieve the relevant knowledge about the topic that you want to discuss. Then you start to do conceptual preparation, where and those concepts that you want to articulate or you want to talk about are prepared. Supposedly, they're sent to the working memory, but as you see, working memory is missing here. This preparation has to take place in working memory. Just to remind you of what working memory is, well, working memory is basically our short-term memory, but the difference is that the theory of working memory assumes that working memory has quite a few components, whereas short-term memory is not that elaborate when it comes to compartmentalization of our memory capacity. So these components in working memory include phonological loop, episodic buffer, and visuospatial sketchpad. And in a previous video I have discussed this. I will provide the link in the comments section, and you can actually go through that video and listen to what I have mentioned about working memory. So it's necessary to use our working memory storage capacity to conceptually prepare what you want to talk about, and almost perhaps at the same time or slightly after this conceptualization of ideas, formulation begins. In order to formulate, we need to use the knowledge about the language, grammar, vocabulary, register, discourse, structure. Basically three things. If I want to summarize these three types of knowledge: semantic, syntactic, and pragmatic knowledge about what you want to say. And while we are doing this, we will be also self-monitoring. For example, if one piece of information is not relevant to what we want to talk about, that piece of information will probably be barred from entering the articulation system, because after formulation we articulate, and that's where this speech is produced. In order to articulate the knowledge or the concepts that we have formulated, we use our articulatory organs, and we rely on the knowledge about language, about pronunciation, and other things. So there is an interaction between all of these stages, between articulation and formulation, and articulation and conceptual preparation. And I'm sorry, I think I have missed this word here. Working memory, I correct myself. Yes, there is a mention of working memory, and that's really good that this model also includes working memory. So working memory is defined as I just defined it. Now there are some critiques for this model. One of them is that the model assumes that speaking is a steady state. I mean, those people who speak, who articulate, whether in the first language or second language, are always in a steady state. In other words, it doesn't show much about the development of our speaking ability over time. If let's say you start to learn a new language, let's say Spanish, after 3 months, what happens to these mechanisms, and where you will be probably lagging behind other components. So that's what we mean by steady state, a kind of critique that was raised by Debott. In addition, it doesn't include any ideas of interaction, because I would assume that the conceptual preparation and formulation, and at the end the articulation of your thoughts, has to do with what the other person or interlocutor is thinking about or is talking about, or the context of situation. Of course, there is a mention of context of interaction here, but it doesn't exactly tell us, the model doesn't exactly tell us how this in an interlocution would affect these three components. And finally, another critique is that it doesn't apply to multilingualism, where a lot of code mixing takes place. For example, in Singapore, if you have ever traveled to Singapore or you're living here, you probably have heard "I want to makan," and makan here means eating. I want to go to eat. So it's a commonly heard kind of sentence. Half of the sentence, or a large part of the words that are used here, are English, but the last word makan is Malay. And those of us who have lived here or are Malay know what that word means, and it refers to food. Now the question is, if I articulate that, well, I have definitely conceptualized it and I have formulated it. Am I a good speaker in this context or not? Well, this model might not have an objection against me being considered a good speaker of any language like English or English and Malay. But the point is that it doesn't include anything about multilingualism or bilingualism. And that's one of the things. The other point which I wanted to talk about here actually relates to the last two critiques, is that monolingual kids and multilingual kids studies have shown that we have this ability to adjust and modify our language at least as young as 2-year-old, when we are as young as 2-year-olds. So there is little stress on the mechanisms of adjustments and modification and how it's done. Of course, not to mention that there is monitoring here and monitoring here, but the idea of adjustment and modification was probably something that started to emerge later, after maybe in late 1990s or around that time. So this model actually can be improved on by including these components or by stressing them further in the model and its elaboration. Now I want to move on to the qualities of spoken language, and as I mentioned before, there are three qualities that we're talking about here. One is fluency, and the other one is complexity, and last is accuracy. Some people also talk about appropriacy, which is not something that Bygate has talked about. Fluency is one of the concepts that Bygate has talked about a lot in the paper. However, the other two components have not been discussed much, so I just touch on them as well and provide some basic ideas about what they are. But let's take a look at fluency first. Fluency is defined as an ability in the second language, or it could be also first language, to produce or comprehend utterances smoothly, rapidly, and accurately. This is like the traditional or the classic definition of fluency. However, when it comes to multilingualism, like I said, if you code switch between two languages that you know and you can speak, is that also considered fluency or not? That's a good question to think about, and I think the classic definition of fluency does not accommodate that. So probably because in the definition of fluency we have the term accurate and accuracy as well. If we go by this definition, if someone rapidly code switches between language A and B, but has a high speed and speaks rapidly, he's probably not he's not considered a fluent person according to this definition, because that's not accurate to code switch between two languages according to the classical definition of fluency. So how do we measure, or how do we evaluate fluency? Fluency is actually reflected in the rate of delivery of the stream of speech. One of the measures that they use is mean length of run, but this is not the only measure that is used, or MLR. MLR is the relative frequency of pausing within utterances and at utterance boundary. So they count it and divide it over a unit of time. That's why it's called relative frequency. And if, for example, over 1 minute or 60 seconds or something, depending on how long that person has been talking, and then an index of fluency will be generated for that person. But the thing is, even when we are delivering a speech, a relatively formal type of speech, in some parts of the speech we might be more fluent, in some other parts we might be less fluent. So one index can give you only an average idea, like a mean score or mean index for the fluency of that speaker in different parts of the speech. If you might be interested to break down fluency over different periods of time in that speech, you can actually also do that. Then finally, Skian and Foster divided fluency into two types: breakdown fluency and repair fluency. Repair fluency is when you think that you have said something which is grammatically wrong, or there is an error in semantics, or just the idea was totally wrong, so you try to correct what you have said. So that affects your fluency in some ways, because you have to stop and sometimes you have to think. So that's called repair fluency. Whereas breakdown fluency is when we start to think about stopping the communication from breaking down, and we start to use certain strategies in order to prevent that from happening. So that's called breakdown fluency. Both of these phenomena, that's breaking down or repair, can actually affect fluency. They usually have a diminishing effect on fluency, meaning that they decrease the fluency rate. Now, there are two other concepts here which I quickly go through. One of them is accuracy. Accuracy is probably the oldest concept of these three, and it can be defined as how much you deviate from a norm. If you deviate from a norm, we basically say that you are making an error. Committing an error or committing a mistake is an indication that the production of language is not accurate or is not correct. Now, of course, you can critique this idea as well, because what that norm will be according to what context. In some contexts, that norm is multilingualism, so it would be fine if you make certain mistakes. Those mistakes are, in that context, let's call it context A, are not necessarily referred to as a mistake. It's like something that is acceptable. But in context B, the same phenomenon can be referred to as a mistake, or can be referred to as a deviation from their norms. Therefore, it's a very tricky concept, and I think more research needs to be done to clarify the concept of accuracy and its need. Finally, we have the concept of complexity, and we can basically break it down into cognitive complexity and linguistic complexity. So cognitive complexity is the relative difficulty with which we process language. It's either spoken language, in our case, of course, or written language. So if we hear or listen to something that's kind of difficult to process, we would say that the cognitive complexity of this task is pretty high. Now, linguistic complexity, so cognitive complexity has to do with what is happening inside the mind or inside the brain of the person. On the other hand, Linguistic complexity refers to the surface information or the surface descriptions, well, just let me revise myself, surface features of the language that we hear or the language that we read. An example will be syntactic complexity or semantic complexity or phonological complexity. All of these can be measured. Actually, there is a device called Co-Matrix, which I have discussed in other videos, which can help you look into different dimensions of complexity of texts. So if you have spoken texts, what you can do is to transcribe them and basically copy and paste that transcription into Co-Matrix, and just click a button, and it will give you a lot of information about the complexity and also other dimensions of the text that you have chosen. Now, based on what I have mentioned so far, Gates goes on to propose a model. This model is based on his own model, which is presented in 1978, and the Lavelles model, which I've just presented. Therefore, I go through this very quickly because most of what you see here has already been discussed. So there are three key components in this model. Component 1 includes 4 basic processes. One of them is conceptualization on top, then formulation, then articulation, and of course you also have a monitor that monitors the ideas that you conceptualize and formulate, and at the end you articulate. So they go hands in hands. And it's really difficult to judge whether the conceptualization always comes first or formulation comes first, or they happen at the same time, because from what I know, no one has been able to measure how or investigate how these three processes work. But I mean, this is still a useful model, pretty much like a map of a city, in which a lot of things are missing but still useful to give us an idea about where things are and how to find things or places. Now, the other component in this model is the stored knowledge, and that's here. This stored knowledge is the knowledge that we store in our long-term memory, and finally, the overall importance of speech purposes, which contributes to the type of knowledge that we process. So, for knowledge, we can consider the real-world knowledge, like general knowledge, knowledge of discourse, and pragmatic patterns, global intentions, expectations, assumptions about shared knowledge and knowledge of discourse, and also you can also consider meaning intentions, because what we mean to say actually helps us to use different types of knowledge that we have already stored. And for formulation, we have different attributes, such as morphosyntactic store, where it's pretty much like a storehouse, like an analogy of a storehouse, where we have stored information about the morphology of words and also the syntactic structure, with syntax being our knowledge to an ability to string together words, and those words are actually the morphemes that we have accumulated in our brain, and morpheme being the smallest meaningful unit of language. And then lexical store, morpholexical store, and phonological store, and then the articulation knowledge, which draws upon the phonetic store with articulated pathways. This is the model that could be applied to classrooms, and this is how we can use it in classrooms. We can use it for some pedagogical activities. For example, to do communication tasks. If you're curious what we mean by communication tasks, I would like to refer you to Abbott in the same paper. Abbott has, I think it's an old idea, but it's still an interesting idea in my opinion. Abbott has divided communication tasks into 5 types. One of them is non-communicative learning. 2 is pre-communicative language learning or practice. 3, communicative language practice. So this is where communication becomes more pronounced. And then structured communication, for example, like the IRF that I discussed in the first installment of this video. That's initiation, response, and feedback. You provide, in other words, you provide the student or the learner with some structure, and you ask them to fluently do whatever is expected. In this case, provide to start with an initiation, then provide response, and then provide a feedback. And finally, authentic communication, which is less controlled, and students can, for example, talk about a topic quite freely based on some sources, for example. Then, so we have got communication tasks where the dimensions of lexicogrammatical ability will be practiced, and this is related to what Abbott would call probably something like structured communication or pre-communicative language practice. And then we have some communicative some tasks which are some exercises which are to help students to practice their lexicogrammatical knowledge and to use them correctly, or if the purpose of the activity is not just accuracy but is complexity or fluency, then to use them fluently and in a complex fashion. So this is how this model can be applied in our classrooms. Right, so the other part of this presentation is about pedagogical responses and the approach to pedagogical responses. I'm going to pause this video here because it's getting quite long, and I'll get back to you in the third section or the third installment of this video. Thank you.